Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out on a cold night. And also want to welcome those of you watching our program tonight on live stream. We're really glad to have you. A few announcements before we start the evening program. First of all, there is a sign-up sheet that will start going around for community members who wish to be added to the course website so as to view and download the readings associated with each of our meetings. So a couple of these are going around. Just if you wish to be added, just put your name and email address and we will add you going forward. We have somebody in the audience, Mary, with us this evening from Food Corps, an AmeriCorps program that specifically focuses on food, health, and nutrition. She is here representing Food Corps that is hiring people in Michigan. So if you are interested in talking with her, she's going to stay after the program this evening for a short time. And she also has flyers that are posted that are in a small pile near the door. If you can't stay afterward and you want to pick one up and take it with you, and you can contact Food Corps that way. I would like to recognize the sponsors who are particularly bringing us this evening's program. The University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, the College of Literature, Science, and Arts, the Office of Instructional Support Services, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Vice Provost's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and also the Community Foundation for Southeastern Michigan. Thank you to all these sponsors who have made tonight's program especially possible. And now I'd like to turn this over to my co-instructor, Malik Yakini, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. How's everyone doing? Good, good, good. We are so proud to have Eric Holt-Giménez with us tonight. Eric, since 2006, has served as the executive director of Food First. He's the editor of the Food First book, Food Movement Unites, Strategies to Transform Our Food Systems. He's the co-author of Food Rebellions, Crisis and Hunger for Justice. He's the author of the book Campesino a Campesino, Voices from Latin America's Farmer to Farmer Movement for Sustainable Agriculture. And his latest book, which I'm sure he'll talk about tonight, is a Foodie's Guide to Capitalism. Eric has an MSc in International Agricultural Development from the University of California at Davis, a PhD in Environmental Studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz. He's taught developmental studies at UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, Boston University, and the National Gastronomic University in Italy. Prior to working at Food First, he served as the Latin America Program Manager for the Bank Information Center in Washington, D.C. In Eric's own words, successful social movements are formed by integrating activism with livelihoods. These integrated movements create the sustained social pressure that produces political will, the key to changing the financial, governmental, and market structures that presently work against sustainability. I'm proud to count Eric as one of my teachers because of his profound understanding of how capitalism impacts the food system. Please give a warm Michigan round of applause to Eric Holt-Giménez.
So I want to give a shout out first to my organization, Food First, Institute for Food and Development Policy. How many of you know about Food First? Quite a few. Okay, great. So it was started 42 years ago by this extraordinary woman named Frances Moore Lepay, who wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet. Let's show of hands, Diet for a Small Planet. Did you read it? Generational thing. You younger people who have read it, good for you. But this is back in the 70s, and you know, the Club of Rome had met, and the book Limits to Growth had come out, and you know, the Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, had come out, and there was, I don't know, like 650 million people were going hungry, and there was tremendous concern about whether or not, you know, overpopulation was going to like eat us out of house and home. Like, all these poor, hungry people were going to use up the world's resources, and the rest of us were not going to have enough food. In those terms, it sounds very ignorant today to say these things, but that's how things were couched then. And so Frances Moore Lappé started looking at the issue. She was a graduate student, and she started looking at the issue. And what she found, she wrote up in Diet for a Small Planet, which I think was really a revolutionary book at the time, considering the way most of the experts of the world thought about population and hunger and resource use and limits to growth in these things. Because what she found was that, in fact, the world was producing more than enough food for everybody. There was this whole myth of scarcity. They were running out of food, running out of resources, and that's why all these people are going hungry, and it's just going to get worse because, they're going to breed, and then you have more poor people who are going to want more food, and it was always about them. It was always about them. It was never like about us and how much we consume in this country. So there was this other whose problem you had to solve. And she found that there wasn't scarcity at all. In fact, there was too much food. There was 1.5 times enough food for every man, woman, and child on the planet. And there was like 1 in 7 people, as the United Nations calculated it, and we're going to get into that. But 1 in 7 people were hungry at the time. And so she said, well, clearly hunger is not the result of scarcity. Hunger results from poverty. Because there's plenty of food, people just can't afford to buy it. And the other thing she said was we're eating much too high on the food chain. And this is causing environmental problems. Rainforests are being cut down to be able to graze cattle for McDonald's, hamburgers. There was the big hamburger connection that was coming up. So I have to say, fast forward from there to today. Anyway, I'm sorry. So she writes this book, and it becomes a bestseller. And they invite her to Rome to talk with world leaders about hunger. And she's shocked. She's like a young graduate student, and she gets there, and oh boy, I get to learn all about world hunger. And they're asking her, what does she think? Because they don't know. They don't really know how many people are going hungry. They don't really know why. And they sure don't know what to do about it. So I guess that was a pretty profound experience for her. The book became a bestseller. She took the proceeds and she started Food First. And very quickly after that, she wrote Hunger 12 Myths with Joe Collins and wrote the book Food First and whatnot. Anyway, so they start this think tank. It's called we call it a People's Think Tank. It used to be called the Institute for Food and Development Policy. But if you shorten that to an acronym, it's IFDIP. So we changed our moniker to Food First. I'm glad. I came along much, much later. I came along almost 30 years later. I stand on some very tall shoulders. Walden Bello has been the executive director, Anuradha Mittal, Peter Rossett, very serious movement people who are embedded in struggles around the world to transform not just the food system, but to transform society. I would say the changes that have happened at Food First since Frances Moore Lappé have not been structural changes. We've changed our approach. I think we've learned at Food First. For one thing, we've gone beyond poverty. I mean, it's to ask, well, wait a minute, why are people poor in the first place? Who's poor? And why are they poor? And then we've also partnered with the social movements who are trying to change the food system, try to change agrarian systems. So we work with farmer movements, peasant movements, food justice movements, food sovereignty movements, food democracy movements, community movements. because these are people on the front lines of transformation, one way or another, and we learned a tremendous amount from them. So, I don't know, we've got something like 50 books in the hopper at this point, and we publish reports, and we have, conferences, and we do events, and we take people around the world to see, in our food sovereignty tours, to look at different experiences of food sovereignty. And I think Food First has always been changing. I think we're especially changing now because the movement is changing so rapidly. And Malik mentioned Food Movements Unite. It was an attempt to bring different voices together from the movement to try to understand the challenges of the movement in the movement's own words. This book, A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, which I'll draw from today, is also really very much written in the spirit of contributing to the movement, trying to establish political economic literacy within the food movement to understand the capitalist food system. And if you want to transform the food system, you kind of want to know what kind of a system it is and how it works. So, and oddly enough, in the United States, that's not usually the case. We don't really talk about capitalism much here. We're starting to now, but up until Occupy, it was awkward even to say the word capitalism. Thanks you, all you guys who stood out in Zuccotti Park and wherever else, getting the flu. But it opened up the conversation. And then there's a tremendous amount of concepts and terminology that we still need to learn. We need to become fluent in, I believe, in order to have an effective food movement, which really challenges the existing food regime. So I'm going to do the clicker thing. Wait a minute. I'm going to try. I did it. So, are you ready to click? How many hungry people are there in the world anyway? What do you think? So we click and then I ask, or what? Or then I tell. Can I hit this? Okay. Just this is the one I can't do. Oh! All right. Okay. How do I know when they're done clicking?
Once that number gets up to 100, see how high you can shoot.
Okay, we're only at 102. That's like a low temperature. Okay, there we go. 103. We're getting hot.
We can cut it off.
Okay, so of course this is a trick question. So 793 million. How many of you thought that was it? No one thinks that? Oh, okay. Oh, I get it. Okay. I warned you. I warned you. Okay, so most people say it's the 1.2 billion. Pretty good. Well, this sort of depends, where you stand depends on where you sit. I mean, 793 million was what the FAO said last year. But now they're saying 815 million. Small correction. In fact, before that, they were saying 1.2 billion. That's why so many of you say that, because that's what the FAO used to say, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Right after the 2008 food price crisis, numbers just swelled to like 1.2 billion, up from 900 something. Everybody freaked out. They immediately began to release a lot of food from storage, trying to bring prices down and whatnot. And then it happens again in 2011. It's like because they didn't address the underlying causes. But then, kind of remarkably, began to hear that hunger was being reduced and got way down there to like 793 million all of a sudden. I mean, like all of a sudden, like in the space of a couple of years. And some of us were like, really? Really? What changed? I don't get it. So, in fact, D, over 2 billion, is the number which I believe is closer to the truth. And I'm going to actually share a section from an upcoming book called, oh, wait a minute, I have more questions, don't I? Sorry. Oh, here we go. Okay, next, we're going to do like a couple of rounds of this, and then we're going to get down and dirty. So, what classifies a person as hungry? Consuming less than 1,200 kilocalories a day for 12 months, less than 1,200 kilocalories a day for 11 months, less than 2,000 for 6 months, or when they feel pangs of hunger in their stomach. All right, clicksters, do your thing. So this just like wait for a pregnant pause, and then it does its thing. Okay. Well, some of you read the FAO reports. Yeah, it's around that. It depends. The FAO says that you have to have less than 1,200 kilocalories a day for 12 months out of the year. But it's not exactly that, because they also they work on heights, like how much do people weigh, how tall are they, and whatnot, which is a little bit weird because so small people, can do with fewer calories, and like big Norwegians can have lots of calories, but the fact is that if you're like really small, it's because you're not getting enough calories. So then to say, well, you don't really need that many is not fair. Anyway, I'm hungry when I have pangs of hunger in my stomach. Who makes up most of the world's hungry? Okay. Well, you're all right. That's exactly who makes up most of the world's hungry. And the twist on this is that most, I guess, unemployed people is not very really fair. You might say self-employed, because most of the world's hungry are farmers, peasant farmers. Most of those farmers are women and girls, and they produce most of the world's food. Well over half of the world's food. And yet they make up well over half of the world's hungry. So, what's up with that? How can that be? And the simple answer, which we'll get into, but the one-liner is exploitation. And there's different ways to do that. There's different ways to extract value from people and accumulate it somewhere else. And then get them to give you even more value afterwards. So these women end up, because they're poor, because they have small parcels of land, and because they're poor, when they harvest their crops, they sell them right away because they need money, because they're poor. And that's the worst time to sell, because everybody's selling. So you're not going to get very much. And then, maybe 6 months later, when they've run out of food in the house, they have to buy food back. And that's the worst time to buy. That's when all the prices are high. And so that's when they go hungry. And that's how it is that on 25%, on 25% of the world's agricultural land, these women can provide up to 70% of the world's food and still go hungry because the value of that food is taken away from them. So what does that tell you about our food system? Yes, it's unfair, clearly, but it's also racist and sexist. Most of these women are brown. And I think that's no mistake that this is happening mostly to women. If we allow this to happen to women, then we allow it to happen to everybody. I kind of answered this, didn't I? Oh, you guys are, okay, click away. I see you're clicking. But the idea of this slide is this sort of maps out the way that the development community has been thinking about hunger over the last 40, 50 years. You think about the way the UN started out in the development decades, 40 years ago. It was, the problem is it's scarcity. And then people say, it's not scarcity, it's poor distribution because there's plenty of food, but not everybody's getting it. And then even if you had good distribution, people can't afford it, so then there's poverty. And then now it's, wait a minute, why are people poor? Particularly, why are people poor after 4 decades of intensive development work, billions and billions of dollars in the development industrial complex being spent around the world to end poverty and hunger? And why are they still poor and why are they still hungry? When we're producing more food than we've ever produced in history. So there are no straight answers to that. You actually have to analyze things. And you have to analyze the system. And the system that we're analyzing is capitalism. It's a capitalist food system. It doesn't do us any good to analyze a socialist food system at this point. What I think this reflects is that the whole notion of hunger is in political dispute. People don't agree how many hungry people there are in the world. And they don't agree on why these people are going hungry. And they don't agree on what should be done about it. And it's not because there's not enough information. And it's not because there's not enough analysis. And it's certainly not because there aren't enough books about food. The world is lousy with books about food, including mine. It's because the whole notion of hunger and poverty is in dispute. It's in political dispute. Because there's a lot of money on the table, and there are a lot of resources involved, and there are a lot of established institutions, like patriarchy, like racism, that hold these injustices in place. And I want to share with you a section of this book because it's about this whole fiasco of measuring hunger. Because I think it's emblematic of this political struggle that we have around hunger. So in 1974 in Bangladesh, well, following the famine, I should say, in Bangladesh, in 1974, the World Conference, Food Conference meets in Rome. And who remembers Henry Kissinger? How could we forget? Henry Kissinger, ultimate political brinksman, promises there in front of the whole world to end hunger, child hunger, in 10 years, in a decade. Now remember, this is at the height of the Cold War, right? So it was very easy for the United States, primary capitalist country, to start making these big promises. In fact, they had to. Back in 1974, things didn't look so good for capitalism. There were a lot of struggles for national liberation. Vietnam was actually winning the war against the United States. So anyway, Kissinger says we're going to end it in 10 years. And actually, there was quite a bit of room for, to be fair, there was room for optimism because, you know, you'd had the Green Revolution around for over a decade. And one way or another, the Green Revolution had increased the food supply enormously. So much so that the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, was given the Nobel Prize. And they claimed that he saved 1 billion people from starvation because of these hybrid seeds that responded to fertilizers and pesticides and irrigation. But the food was increasing by about 12% per capita per year. So every year, every one of us, or everybody then, should have had 12% more food. Right? Oddly enough, and this is what Frankie LePay discovered, hunger was increasing by 12% a year too. So clearly not everybody was getting the food. So then at the 1996 World Food Summit, the world leaders take a step back because, you know, first they thought they were going to end hunger in 10 years. And then it turns out, well, it looks like it's not so easy. So they pledged to reduce the number of hungry people by half by 2015. You know, like in 20 years. That's a big step back from we're going to end all hunger in 10 years. We're going to end half of it in 20. I guess that was pretty sobering. But 4 years later, at the 2000 Millennial Summit, they reaffirmed the pledge. This is what we're going to do. But then 2 years later, at the World Food Summit, World Food Summit +5, they had to say the thing wasn't working, and world hunger had risen to about 850 million people. Then in 2008, the food price crisis hits, sends the price of food skyrocketing beyond anything that's ever been recorded. And we get 1.2 billion people filling the ranks of the hungry. So everybody rushes to try and bring the food prices down. In the United States at that time, something like 60 billion yearly in government food nutrition programs were trying to feed, we have 45 million hungry people through about 50,000 food banks. So it wasn't just something that was happening to the global south, it was happening right here. 2 years later, in 2013, the United Nations announced that the number of hungry people was falling again. This was followed by a 2016 final report by the Millennium Development Goals that declared, very boldly, projections indicate a drop of almost half in the proportion of undernourished people in the developing regions. In 2017, reversing 4 years of optimistic reports, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations had to admit that hunger was once again on the rise. In addition to an increase in the proportion of the world's population that suffers from chronic hunger, the number of undernourished people on the planet has also increased to 815 million, up from 717 million in 2015. The good news on the number of hungry people had been short-lived. The devil, it turns out, was in the counting. So what explains this dramatic 4-year reversal? Suddenly, no matter, hunger is disappearing and then suddenly it's appearing again. Well, the FAO says, well, it's because of some droughts and some floods and a lot of conflict in Asia and Africa. But there was conflict and droughts and floods before. So that's really not a very good explanation. So we need to kind of look at this short history of hunger measurement that went on during this period from the time Henry Kissinger says we're going to end hunger until the 2016 report by the FAO. Because some analyses indicate that even though there's enough food to feed everybody 3,000 calories a day, almost half the world is going hungry or is malnourished. And how can this be so different? Well, at that food summit in 1996, they reaffirmed the 1974 World Conference, but they decided that ending hunger was too ambitious. So they decided to reduce the total number of hungry people only by half to 420 million by 2015. But then at the Millennium Summit, just 4 years later, they decide, let's not reduce the total numbers, let's reduce the proportion. Let's just reduce it by 50% by 2015. But because of global population increase, that means that the hunger target was only for 296 million people, not 420 million, because they're just doing it proportionally now. Then the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, weaken the target even more by declaring that by halving the proportion of hungry people would only apply to developing nations, where population growth is the highest. So that meant that even more people would be allowed to go hungry. And the next measure they used to sort of statistically ease these beleaguered commitments was to backdate the base year from 2000, when the goals were agreed upon, the MDGs were agreed upon, to 1990. Now, why would they do that? Because first of all, it allowed the rich Western countries to take advantage of China's extraordinary accomplishments throughout the 1990s, in which millions of people were pulled from poverty and hunger. Remember that China had one of the last great famines of the 20th century during the Great Leap Forward. And so to go from that to being the only country which actually lowered hunger, I think is extraordinary. And remember that China had extensive land reform, which allowed them to do this. It also extended the period of population growth and increased the proportion of people saved from hunger and allowed the MDGs to claim gains in hunger reduction before they actually began. In fact, the new MDG for hunger increased the acceptable number of hungry people in the world from 420 million to 591 million and slowed the rate of hunger reduction from 3.5% a year to 1.2% a year, down almost 1/3 from its original rate. But that's not all. The UN then decides they're going to change the original numbers in the baseline, the 1990 numbers. They're going to change those numbers, and they did. Twice. In 92, the FAO reported that in 1990, 786 million people had gone hungry in the developing world. 10 years later, a year after the MDGs were signed, they inflated the number to 816 million. This allowed the FAO to report a decrease of 30 million more hungry people than otherwise would have been the case. Then in 2004, the FAO reports that hunger had increased to 815 million people. Even with the revised calculations, that meant that in 4 years, hunger had been reduced by only 1 million people. Hunger had actually increased from the original 1990 calculation of 786 million. So the FAO revised the original 1980 figure again, increasing it to 824 million, so that hunger appeared to have decreased after all. Now, I know this is a little convoluted, but if you want to take it slow, you can buy the book and you can go over this really slow. It's in this book, too. And I kind of like this graphic that we did at Food First, because it shows the manipulation by backdating, by going proportional. And then in 2008, the global food price crisis hits. It drives over 150 million people into the ranks of the hungry. The FAO has to say there's 1.2 billion people going hungry at a time of record harvests and record profits for agri-foods corporations. So the 2015 Millennium Development Goals expiration date was sneaking up on the FAO. So they revised the numbers again. In 2012, they announced hunger in the developing world was down from its record high of over 1 billion in 2008 to only 852 million people. It was still higher than the 824 million from 1990, and it meant that the world was moving away from the MDG target, not towards it. So the FAO adjusts the 19 numbers up again from 824 million to 980 million. So this made it appear that proportional hunger was actually decreasing from 23% in 1990 to 15% in 2012. And then the United Nations 2013 report proclaims progress in reducing hunger has been more pronounced than previously believed, and the target of halving the percentage of people suffering from hunger by 2015 is within our reach. Well, they'd abandoned their forecasting model, their original forecasting model, so it wouldn't reflect the impact of the economic crisis in 2008. And it erased the hunger spike in 2008. And they used new estimates on food supplies and food waste, new population estimates, new assumptions about food inequality and access to calories. And these changes all worked. The numbers released in 2012 indicated that hunger was constant during the period of the food crisis. Like, astonishingly, the FAO states in a little footnote, this methodology does not fully reflect the effects of hunger of the 2007-2008 price spikes. But how could you ignore price spikes which affected 150 million people? Just didn't fit in the statistics. The FAO only counts people as hungry when their caloric intake is inadequate to cover minimum needs of sedentary people for over a year. So 120,000 kilocalories over the course of a year. How many calories do you think a woman farmer in the Senegambia who is nursing 3 children burns in the course of a day? I need another clicker, don't I? Well, for each child, you need another 500 calories, right? And then you're outside in the heat, working hard. You need 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calories a day. And yet they're measuring hunger at 1,200 kilocalories a day. That's like, a tenured professor sitting very quietly at their computer. It's not like a farmer. It's absurd. Anyway, if we take this measure of hunger, it's closer to 2.5 billion to 3 billion people are going hungry. And I think that, why did they do this? I mean, there's one thing to be embarrassed that your forecasting is wrong. And you say, well, we were wrong, and then you move on. But this continual manipulation and backdating and attempting to appear as though hunger is being eradicated when in fact it's not. Why would the FAO do that? I mean, the Millennium Development Goals are supposed to keep us on, were supposed to keep us on track to doing these things. But we cheated. Well, I can tell you very well why they did that. It's because if they were to admit that hunger had been increasing over the last 50 years, despite the Green Revolution, despite the development decades, and despite 25 years of neoliberalism, which privatized public goods, which devalued currency, which shut down the grain stores, and which made most of the world dependent on the global market for their food, it would mean admitting that none of these things worked. It would be like driving an ideological stake into the heart of capitalism. It means that no matter how productive capitalism is, it just can't seem to get rid of hunger. And maybe people might stop and begin to think, maybe hunger is endemic to capitalism. Maybe capitalism needs hunger. Maybe capitalism needs poor people. Maybe this is just not working. Because after, socialism gets such a bad rap, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, capitalism wins, it's the end of history, Fukuyama celebrates. But wait a minute, it's not over yet. In fact, this system is not working either. And it's destroying the planet and peoples. So the FAO was under tremendous pressure to show good numbers. Who's in the FAO? These are the governments of the world. And who are the governments of the world responding to? Yes, they're responding to their constituents, they're also responding to the agri-foods industry. This means that it's not working. And in fact, it isn't working. And now I think it's impossible to cover up. I'm going to take a step back. The food price crisis of 2008, happened during a time of record harvests and record profits and record hunger. I just down here, the bumper profits for ADM, Archer Daniels Midlands, in 2008 had an increase in profits, 20%. Monsanto's profits increased 45%. Cargill's were up 86%. Mostly because of Mosaic, they sell fertilizer, and fertilizer profits were up high. And General Foods, that would be the same for, Safeway, Lucky's, Carrefour, Tesco, up 61%. So all these people are making bank while over 1 billion people are going hungry. And we talked a lot about the proximate causes, which I've already mentioned, but also the higher price of oil. Everything gets more expensive if you have an oil-based food system. But I think we need to talk about the root causes, the systemic causes. And one is that we just have the capitalist food system is an incredibly vulnerable food system. We have a handful, 5 different crops take up 90% of the cropland. So it's very vulnerable to economic and environmental shock. Within those crops, there's only a few varieties, really, that dominate the global food system. Now, that doesn't mean all food around the world, but the global food system, which is exchanged around the world, is dominated by these crops. And it's also dominated by the monopolies, the grain traders and the seed companies and the retailers and distributors. And so this agri-foods complex has gone through, you can take it back to the time of colonialism, but if we look at the Green Revolution, it comes out in the 60s. The really important thing to remember about the Green Revolution, it was an anti-communist crusade. We had to show that we were better than Soviets. And so we roll out this fancy technology. The other thing to realize is that it responds to a crisis of overaccumulation in the United States on the part of agribusiness. So what does that mean? So what happened was that after the Second World War, the United States comes through unscathed in terms of our productive infrastructure, whereas Europe is destroyed, and much of Asia is destroyed. So, in fact, agriculture did very well because we were exporting food because the Europeans weren't growing it. And so with the Marshall Plan, we send food, and we pump up the production in this country, but pretty soon farmers are producing all they can. We can't consume it here, and the Europeans can't consume it all either. And then farmers can't consume the inputs. In other words, we're producing too much fertilizer, too much pesticide, too much machinery, too much irrigation. Farmers can't absorb it all. That's a crisis of accumulation. Right? They accumulated too much of this capital, these factors of production. So one option would have been, let's not make so many tractors. Let's produce less fertilizer. Right? That would make sense, right, if no one's buying your stuff. But that's not the nature of capitalism. The nature of capitalism is to grow, always. So you have to break down markets around the world. So first, we loan the Europeans money and sell them the technology. They start overproducing. And then we've all got to go somewhere. Prices are dropping because of all this overproduction. So we take that food, turn it into food aid, dump it into the third world at prices that are below the cost of production, and we put all those farmers out of business with food. That's what food aid is about. And if you read the rationale for food aid on the USDA website from the original documents of food aid, it's about opening markets, getting people used to our products, undercutting their food system, making them dependent on us. At the same time that we're exporting all this extra food that we don't know what to do with, I shouldn't say we don't know what to do with it. We know exactly what to do with it. We destroy other people's markets. We destroy other people's food systems. We capture those markets. Then we have the problem with the fertilizers and the pesticides and the seeds, ship those out too. And that's where the manipulation over the numbers of hungry people come in. Because suddenly, oh my God, the whole world is hungry. And you get these really Malthusian, sort of hysterical Malthusian discourses around we've got to save the world from hunger. Read, we've got to sell our products. Because what happened? So we loan the money out to the third world. Private northern banks loan the money to the third world. With that money, they buy our technology. And they start producing food. But at the same time, you have Earl Butz running around saying to the American farmer, you're the most productive farmer in the history of the world. Plant fence row to fence row. You can feed the world. And they do. But everybody's producing more now. So prices crash. That's the Green Revolution. So when prices crash, what happens? Well, here, farmers go bankrupt. We lost half of our farmers in the 70s. Half. Half. In the course of a decade. We went from 4% to 2% of the population. Now we have more people in jail than we have on the land. But you can't really foreclose on Mexico, right? You can't foreclose on India. So what do we do with those guys? You loan them more money so they can keep up the payments on their debt with conditionality. So the way it worked, the World Bank would step in and loan the country more money. That way you can pay off Wall Street. You can pay off the banks on Bond Street. This is public money, by the way, to pay off private banks. This is our money. Our government's money, our taxes. But you had to sign, you got to talk to this guy. It was always a guy in a suit. And it was from the International Monetary Fund. And then he said, you got to remove your tariff barriers. You got to dismantle your marketing boards. which protect you from overproduction, stop growing food. Export non-food export crops, because you need foreign exchange because you got to pay back your loans in dollars. And dismantle all of your grain reserves. Now, if we were so concerned about hunger, it seems like lunacy to dismantle a grain reserve. Don't you want that food to feed people with? I mean, shouldn't you have a reserve for a rainy day, or when it doesn't rain, or it rains too much? Right? But the thing about grain reserves is that they keep the price of grain stable. Because if the price goes up, you can release grain, and it brings the price down. If the price goes down, you can buy up grain. It brings the price back up again, because that's what farmers like. You like a stable price, preferably a parity price, but we haven't seen those since the 1920s. So why would they ask them to dismantle all the grain reserves? I mean, this is clearly a plan to make the world dependent upon the food from the North, from the United States, from Europe. Before it was the other way around. The colonies supplied food and natural resources to the North so the North could industrialize. And the North does, but then it industrializes its agriculture and overproduces and gets into a crisis of accumulation, so now it's got to shove all this stuff off onto the South. So the South has to become dependent on the North. The flow of food is reversed. It was going from south to north, now it's going from north to south. People didn't like this. People around the world rebelled. Farmers here rebelled. Tractorcades on Washington grabbed the phone in the Department of Agriculture, start cutting grain deals with the Soviets. It was pretty wild. And there was a debtors cartel forming in the global South. Like, I'm not going to pay this debt. Why should we pay this debt? We've paid it many times over with the interest. Kind of like your house. You pay more out in interest than principal. And besides, most of these debts were entered into, with corrupt governments. Why should we, the people, the workers of these countries, the farmers of these countries, pay for that? So there was a debtors cartel. And very quickly, the North moved to sabotage the debtors cartel. And they brought in the free trade agreements. And what the free trade agreements did was they took the structural adjustment policies and they cemented them into international treaty, which means that the citizens could no longer influence them. Because before, during the structural adjustment policies in the 80s and into the 90s, people were like voting the bums out. You guys signed these things, these structural adjustment policies, throwing us out of work, privatizing everything? You're out of here. And they would elect progressive candidates which wouldn't honor the structural adjustment agreements. But if it's treaty, you can't touch that. Very, very difficult. So they protect this relation of extraction and exploitation within the free trade agreements. That's what NAFTA was all about. That's what the TPP was going to be all about as well. Anyway, the results have been catastrophic, and they're actually worse than what we see up there, because this is kind of a dated slide. But the Global South used to produce a surplus of food. All that time we said they were starving, they were actually producing a surplus of food. Right? Now they import 11 times what they used to export. Industrial agriculture spreads around the world, but it also produces up to 20% of the world's greenhouse gases and uses up 80% of its water. So we've lost something like 75% of our crop diversity. I was in the Philippines once with my students, and we went to the International Rice Research Institute. And this is sort of the pirate's den where the seeds of the world are kept. Really? Okay. And because all these seeds have been pirated, they've been stolen from peasants, and they're putting in these seed banks, and then you take those seeds and you make hybrids, and you sell them, right? And you certainly don't pay any royalties to the peasants who developed these seeds over the course of centuries. Right? And the guy who was taking care of the seed bank, it's like a refrigerator down, like the vault up in the Arctic, but it's in the Philippines, so they have to use a lot of air conditioning. You get down there, there's all these seeds, and then little containers, and he's talking to my students about how great it is. This is the patrimony of the world, and on and on. And I stayed and talked to him after the students left, and he's spending his entire career down in that refrigerator. And he said, like with tears in his eyes, he said, we're losing these seeds. We can't keep up. They're rotting. You got to plant them out, every 3 years. You can't just keep them there. They're in vitro. The best place to keep seeds are in situ, in the fields, with farmers. They're the ones who keep the genetic material vibrant and alive. So what I was describing to you is basically this corporate food regime. Think about the food regime as a rule-governed structure of production and consumption of food on a world scale. Think about all of the rules and all of the institutions. So World Bank, International Monetary Fund, FAO, and then the rules, which would be the free trade agreements, the Farm Bill for the world, and then all of the monopolies and whatnot, and big philanthropy like Bill Gates and those guys. They're part of this food regime. They run the show. They set the rules for the regime. This is a capitalist food regime, so it goes through two different phases. Karl Polanyi discovered that capitalism always goes through two phases. It goes through a phase of liberalization and a phase of reform. Liberalization means they take the gloves off the market. The market does whatever it wants. No regulations, no labor regulations, no tariff regulations, no environmental regulations. But sooner or later, this has happened many times. This isn't new. We call that neoliberalism today, but this happened in the past many times. Capitalism expands, it concentrates wealth, but then people can't take it anymore because you basically destroy society when you do this. You destroy the public sphere. You destroy the moral economy. You destroy the ways we care for each other. You destroy the public sector. Everything is privatized. When society is exposed like this, sooner or later they fight back. And then the system goes into a period of reform, where they regulate supply and markets and consumption to restabilize the regime. Think about the Roaring '20s, the big crash, and then the New Deal. The New Deal was the reformist period. Along come Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the '80s, and they dismantle all of that, and they bring us into a new liberal period where everything is privatized again. The market reigns supreme. So this is actually good news. Doesn't look good. I know, this looks terrible. But I have to study this every day. So we know that we have a capitalist food regime. We know that it goes between liberalization and reform. We know that it has several components. Like the neoliberals and the reformists don't disappear, they're still there. But the neoliberals are hegemonic. We thought maybe neoliberalism was going to end with Obama. We were wrong. It really picks up steam with Clinton. Obama continues the neoliberal regime. And Trump, what is he even talking about? But neoliberalism carries on. And the reformists are quite weak. So the neoliberals believe in food enterprise, and they're committed to overproduction and busting down markets. And the reformists talk about food security with safety nets for people, talking about mainstreaming the good things. But that's the corporate food regime. And the counter movement, Polanyi was very clear about this. Reform doesn't come about just because of the goodwill of reformists. Roosevelt was probably a good man. But one of the most famous things he said was, "That's a great idea. Now go out there and make me do it." And what he meant was, I'm not going to be able to do this unless we can create the political will. I'm just the president. So you need a strong counter-movement in order to push the capitalist regime from liberalization to reform. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. So what's been missing up to now? We've had multiple crashes, multiple crises. We have ongoing long-term crises, which are becoming more than evident now with climate change. Why do we have no reform? Even reform to stabilize the regime, much less transform it, because the counter-movements are not strong enough. The social movements aren't strong enough to create the political will for reform. I'm talking movements writ large. Women's movement, climate movement, food movement, workers' movement. All these movements, they're not strong enough. Part because we're fragmented. Right? And I would say, and I'm not the only one, but, okay, I'm sort of biased, but other people say this too. I think that the food movement is one of the most promising and hopeful manifestations of these historic counter-movement. This always happens. There's always a counter-movement. Might take a long time, but there's always there. And I think the food movement is pivotal, is critical to the construction of a strong counter-movement. It brings so many of us together. But there are things driving us apart, and I'm going to end on this. So if you look at the food movement here, I divide it into two. This transitional, you can also call it progressive, and this transformational, you can also call it radical. So here's where I think most of us are in this country. We fall in here. We're all about food justice, community food security, CSAs, food policy councils, slow foods, alternative, fair trade, etc. About agroecology. We're really getting the practices right. You know, people are working on things very immediate, sometimes for their own survival, right? But very focused, and with a tremendous amount of expertise, I think. And then there's another wing of the food movement, which is much more radical, which is about changing the rules and changing the structures. Getting agriculture out of the WTO, for example. Applying our antitrust laws. Breaking up the monopolies, not letting them consolidate. These are really structural issues, which are critical of capital, right? And they're kind of over here. This is the food sovereignty movement, and these guys we're about empowerment here, they're more about entitlement. This is ours. We want reparations. We want land reform. We want to democratize the food system in favor of the poor. So, our thesis is that this progressive transitional current is pivotal. Because if they form alliances with the reformists in the food regime, and that's very easy to do because these reformists are weak and they're looking for alliances. So if these alliances are formed, then you split the food movement down the middle. You split the counter movement and you make it weaker. But if we were able to form these alliances between the progressives and the radicals, right, then the food movement would be stronger. The counter movement would be stronger, and we'd have a better chance at actually forcing reforms, and possibly even transformational reforms. The problem is not just one of ideology. If some of you did the readings for the course, I think assigned chapter 3 or 4, was it? 1 and 5? Yeah, chapter 5, about class, gender, and race. These are the things that divide us. Our food movement is no exception. Our food movement reflects our society in many ways. Our society is rent by divisions of class and gender and race. So that means that if we want to build these strong alliances, we've got to address patriarchy. We've got to address white privilege. We've got to address class. We've got to overcome these divisions. This isn't extra work. This is the work. Dismantling racism is the work for building a strong food movement. Dismantling patriarchy is the work. Now, you won't get funded for doing most of this, but we really don't have any choice, do we? We have to find a way to converge in all of our diversity. And we have to find a way to sort of repoliticize our movements, so we're talking about capitalism again. Okay? We've got to identify this food regime for what it is. We need a language for this, we need concepts for this. And that's one of the things that Food First is trying to do. Thank you.
We have time for questions, and we'll take questions from those of you here in the hall with these microphones that Fern and Mariah have here, but also those of you who are watching us through live stream can tweet in questions using the hashtag Food Literacy for All. So please. We'll ask you to wait till the microphone comes to you when you have a question so that everybody can hear that and so we can capture that on recording.
So I'm curious, given how much power is concentrated in the hands of the powerful now, what you think are effective strategies for small movements and individuals to make changes within this system?
One by one? Yeah. I think that it's essential to reestablish the public sphere. That's that area where we make decisions based on normative principles, not what the market tells us to do. Because if we base it on the market, then whoever has the most market power gets to make the decisions, and we know who those guys are. So we have to reestablish the public sphere. I mean, before we can even reestablish the public sector, which has been gutted and is still under attack, we have to reestablish the public sphere. We have to talk to each other. We have to come together. We have to analyze together. We have to act together. And one of the, I think, really promising developments, just naturally developed, are food policy councils. Food policy councils, people from all walks of society come together, like in a somewhere, right? You know, like this is the city food policy council, like in Detroit. And you come into this space in a real place called Detroit, right? With feet on the ground, and debate, and engage in the politics. I think we've got to do that. Otherwise, I don't know what this next step would be. And I don't think that's a trivial task. I know it's not easy in food policy councils. I've helped set them up, and I've been in them, and we study them at Food First. And I have tremendous respect for the people who put their time and effort into food policy councils. I know that sometimes people are very frustrated. But it's one of the ways that the food movement can rebuild the public sphere. And that has multiple benefits, political and social benefits, for all the other tasks that we have. You know, we've got to localize the wealth of the food system. It's a $6 trillion system, but it's all concentrating at the top. So we've got to economically democratize the food chain and localize it as much as possible. Not for some sort of ideological, ecological reason, but because for political purposes. I don't think we'll ever be able to get anywhere unless we do that. I think that's how we begin to build the food sovereignty that we need to begin to confront this other system.
Could you, if you think about it in these terms, define or differentiate your use of the word capitalism from the use of medium to exchange value of labor or goods in exchange for a currency. Does that make sense?
So
you're using
essentially,
capitalism in a way.
capitalism is a system in which the owners of the means of production get the benefits from the workers, right? That's why it's not called workerism. And with farmers, there's an illusion that they're the capitalists because they're the owners of their own means of production. But when you look at the food value chain, only less than 20% of the food dollar goes to the farmers. The money made from food is made on the upstream side with the seeds and the machinery and the inputs, or on the downstream sides with the processed stuff, or with meat or whatever it is. So they're very small. We're much more like serfs, really. You think about the capitalist, how the capitalist food system works with poultry, the contracts, the poultry contracts, or some of the hog contracts now. They call it the chickenization of hogs. It's about the contracts, where basically you're a serf. You're working for Smithfield Tyson. You're out there. So that's what I mean by that the benefits accrue to the owners of the means of production. And then what capital does is when you are able to extract, they call it surplus value, that extra part of the value which was created that you don't let the worker have, we call it profits, but you take that and you've got to reinvest it immediately. You can't just sit on it. You've got to reinvest it some way, and that's the nature of capital. Is you keep reinvesting and you keep expanding, because if you don't, somebody else will and then knock you out of the market. I don't know if that's the explanation you were looking for. I mean, we've been trading, buying and selling things, forever. I mean,
We use the word capitalism very casually.
well,
So I was just curious to hear that.
yeah. No, I think we shouldn't use it casually. I think we should use it politically and analytically. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. What do you make of the extreme hunger in socialist countries like Venezuela and North Korea?
Well, I can't answer about North Korea. I can say something about Venezuela. So it's funny because I got interviewed on Food Chain the other day, Michael Olson. I don't know if you guys listened to him. And somebody just warned me, said, watch out, this is going to be an aggressive interview. And he didn't really do anything except he tried to get me to talk about Venezuela. Because he wanted to say, oh, should we have socialism or capitalism? He wanted to have this sort of dyad because if it's not capitalism, then it's got to be Venezuela. It's sort of and then Venezuela is doing so poorly that you don't want to do that. So what happened to Venezuela was that it was always for the last half century, it's been an oil country. Source of revenues come from is oil. And before Chavez, those revenues accrued to the bourgeoisie. Venezuela bought its food. You look at Venezuelan food systems, they're incredibly dependent on I've always been, since the advent of oil as a commodity, been dependent on the global market for their food and have let agriculture just sort of wither. And then when Chavez gets in, he begins to redistribute the wealth of the oil and sets up all kinds of social programs for poor people and sets up comedores and popular stores for people to buy food at subsidized rates, highly subsidized rates. And that's fine until the price of oil drops. And then the state is no longer able, the state has great difficulty in fulfilling these social obligations which were started by Chavez. Then Chavez dies, Maduro comes in, and the bourgeoisie decides to go in for the kill. And it turns out that the retailers in Venezuela is the bourgeoisie. They control the retail sector. And they hate Maduro. They hated Chavez. So they're hoarding, essentially. They're trying to bring the government down by hoarding food. And that's, if you ask why is Venezuela in such poor shape in terms of food security, I would say it's more because of internal conflict than it is by socialism, and it's more because of the structure of their economy, which Chavez was trying to get out of. I mean, he was trying to develop agriculture. Not an easy thing to do when it's much easier to go to a subsidized store and buy this stuff. But Chavez had schools. He worked with the Via Campesina to establish agroecology schools. They were trying to get people back on the land, trying to get young people interested in farming. But when the United States is supporting your opposition, which is not terribly loyal, it's very different. And then this is what they zero in on. Henry Kissinger said, when you control the oil, you control a country. You control the food, you control the people. And I think there's never more of a classic case than Venezuela. That's what the food is in dispute, just as the oil is in dispute.
It's almost 8 o'clock, and I think we need to wrap up now because the end of the class time has come to an end. So I'd like to, with this very interesting presentation and these great questions, Eric and all of you have given us a lot to think about. Let's thank Eric once again.
Thank you.